it all starts with having great people around you. First-class leaders on your team are important because if you have first-class leaders around you, they will then bring first-class leaders to work with them, and those first-class leaders will then get first-class leaders to work with them, and the entire organization then becomes a first-class organization. If you compromise on people around you, second-class leaders hire third-class leaders, and third-class leaders hire fourth-class leaders. And so all of a sudden, the entire organization becomes suboptimal.
That's Vladimir Makatsaria, president of Johnson & Johnson's medical devices business in Asia Pacific. Vladimir is one of the world's growth leaders. That is a leader who can drive performance today while transforming the business for tomorrow and energizing their people at the same time.
As I built more experience in leadership throughout the years, I've transitioned from looking at somebody's experience to trying to understand their character.
As well as being a growth leader himself, Vladimir actively seeks out and develops other growth leaders to drive his business forward. This is something I found to be essential for anyone who truly wants to scale their business for growth. I'm Allison Eyring, organization psychologist, CEO, and endurance athlete. I've spent the last 25 years helping companies solve the people and organizational challenges of growth. I've worked with all types of CEOs and business leaders across the world, but it takes a special type of leader to successfully grow. I call them growth leaders. These leaders seem to have that magical formula that allows them to drive performance results today while transforming their business for tomorrow, and yet still keep people energized. Growth Leaders is my new podcast where I'll show you what it takes to successfully lead business growth through conversations with some of the best growth leaders I know. Vladimir, thanks for joining us.
It's a pleasure to be here. Thank you for the invitation.
So Vladimir, tell us, what city did you grow up in?
I grew up in Moscow, Russia.
And what was your very, very first job?
I worked as a tennis coach in one of the tennis clubs in Moscow.
And how old were you?
I was my teenage years.
So just a few years ago. So tell me a little bit about your role now.
I work for Johnson & Johnson. In my role today, I'm leading our medical devices business across Asia Pacific.
Tell me, Vladimir, what does driving growth mean to you?
Well, driving growth has many dimensions. It's creating an organization where people feel that they can grow and develop, organization that is engaged, that is inspired, where leaders can reach their potential. It's an organization that delivers significant value to the customers. In our case, in Johnson & Johnson, we bring health and well-being to people across the world, and that means growth, growth of health, growth of well-being of our customers. And it also means growing the business, growing the numbers, whether it's revenue or profit, something that will sustain the business longer term.
I love that. You're talking about some of the elements that I always think about for growth leadership, which is around helping the business perform at the same time that it transforms, and at the same time you're energizing or fueling people for the long term. Absolutely.
It's all interconnected.
Now, do you identify as a growth leader yourself?
I aspire to be, and it's a journey, right? I think once we become complacent about it, we're not going to be growth leaders anymore. So it is a journey.
Well, I love that, because one of our goals for this podcast series is to really inspire leaders to be growth leaders.
So it's great to be a part of it.
So let me ask you a couple of questions about pace, because pace is something we often talk about. Often we talk about the need to go faster. Can you tell me about a time when you as a leader went too fast and what happened?
Typically, this happens when you find yourself in a new situation. So there were times when I move across regions or across different roles, and I jump to conclusions very fast. And what I've learned throughout the years is that leading with questions is much more relevant and impactful than leading with answers. But also then it takes time to learn. And now I have a rule, if I move to a new position, I think it's important to portray a level of humility to accept that you don't have all the answers, and asking questions is much more important. And my rule is then I take, anywhere from 4 to 6 months to really assess the situation, to be all ears and eyes and understand what's happening. And I won't make any big decisions until then. Now, if you wait much longer after 6 months, then it's difficult then to make big changes because you become part of the situation. And so for me, this kind of 4 to 6 months time frame to make big decisions is a milestone that I work from.
Have you seen in your career that as you move into successively senior roles, that time frame becomes longer, that you wait, that you need to go slower?
I'm not sure if the pace varies. The necessity to listen better changes. Because especially in cultures that are hierarchical, you find yourself in the situations when it's the quality of questions that really triggers people to tell you the true insights without sugarcoating or being too polite.
I really like that you have identified the need to go slow when you're in a transition, because there's so much pressure on leaders to get to land and take action. And there's so much myth around, the first 90 days and get in there. So I think that's a great lesson for leaders to think about. How can you slow down so you really hear what people are saying? You really understand the situation before you take action.
Yeah, absolutely. And the other piece I would say is, in a time where the pace of change is significantly increasing, we also need to be much more selective with the change that we drive as leaders, and making sure that whatever change we implement and lead through, that it first of all adds value to our customers. Second, it adds value to our organization and make our organization perform better. And so many times I see now that different organizations implement changes that fail, and they fail for that simple reason that it's not customer-centric change.
I think that's a great way of thinking about how do you, in a world that's going faster, how do you prioritize and maybe do less and get more for that?
Absolutely.
Now, let me ask you about the opposite situation. Have you ever found that you were going too slow and you needed to speed up?
Yeah, so it's a flip side of the same coin, right? It's when, it's like I said, if you wait much longer than 6 months, and then you become part of the problem yourself. And also, if the change that you need to implement is transformational and will have a significant disruption, it's also much more challenging to implement. So in a situation like this, I think you go back to this value that you're trying to bring to customer through this change, and force yourself to do the change if it adds value there.
What I've learned through the years in training for triathlons is that you have to push yourself to go as fast and far as you can, but no further so you don't get hurt or burned out. Growing a business, leaders need to push their organization and people to perform and transform, but no further until they've built the right capabilities to sustain enduring growth. I call this discipline intelligent restraint. Sometimes it means going slower, and other times it means going faster. I wanted to know what Vladimir thought about intelligent restraint. Vladimir, one of the rules of intelligent restraint is that routines beat strengths. Can you tell me about a situation where you found yourself or one of the leaders in your team over-relying on a strength?
Mm-hmm. Actually, let me maybe step back a little bit. And I think that for the organization or an individual leader to perform well, it's important to build your strength into the routine. Let me just try to spell it out a little bit. So first of all, sometimes as leaders, when we develop people around us, we focus on the areas of improvement or weaknesses. When I sit down with my leaders throughout my career to do annual review of performance, we would talk a little bit about my strengths, and then we mainly focus about my areas of development. And let me tell you, I have exactly the same areas of development now that I had 20 plus years ago when I started in the healthcare industry. And really, whether you in business, in sports, or in general in life, I do believe that focusing on the strengths and understanding how to use your strength in a more meaningful way is much more important than trying to transform your weaknesses into your strengths. It's important to mitigate weaknesses and make sure they're not derailers, but I think focusing on the strength is much more important.
In my work, I find that many leaders over-rely on their strengths. It's easier to do this than to address your weak points. Instead, I encourage leaders to build what I call growth routines, ones that can help you mitigate your weak points, get things done, and conserve energy for what matters. Our research was very clear that growth leaders drove focus. Tell me a little bit about how you drive focus in your organization.
Just building on the previous point and focusing the organization on simple, in a way, but difficult to achieve aspiration of tripling the number of patients with touch across Asia Pacific. We try to make sure that all of our long-term goals, but also short-term goals, are aligned around that aspiration. For Johnson & Johnson, in a way, it's, on one hand, it's a large and complex organization. On the other hand, it's an organization that is globally guided by the principles described in our Credo. It was a document, basically a leadership essay, written by Robert Wood Johnson, who led the company in the middle of last century. And 75 years ago, he wrote the document just before he took the company public. And the document outlines the 4 major responsibilities that every employee in Johnson & Johnson has. And it starts with our first responsibility to our customers, to mothers and fathers, to patients, to nurses and doctors, all those people who use our products. Our second responsibility is to the employees of Johnson & Johnson around the world, making sure that they're treated fairly, making sure that we create an environment where all of our employees can be at their best. We have responsibility to the communities in which we work and live. And the social responsibility for Johnson & Johnson is our key focus area. And then if we achieve the first 3, if we follow the first 3 principles, then the last one, the responsibility to the shareholder, should be achieved. When we talk about focus, for us, focus is very simple. It's really those 4 key stakeholders that we need to make sure that we do our best for. And it's our responsibility to customers, to employees, to communities, and to our stakeholders.
Growth leaders need to balance driving today's performance with building the capabilities they need for tomorrow's growth. But they need to be able to do it in a way that doesn't burn out people in the organization. I believe that an organization's collective energy is a strategic asset, and that leaders need to manage it as such. I wanted to know what Vladimir thought about managing energy and how a healthcare company like J&J approaches energy. Talk to me a little bit about energy. Leading growth is difficult work, and it can be exhausting to try to lead the organization to perform and transform. And when I talk about energy, I might be talking about physical energy, psychological, emotional. How do you manage your own energy?
No, it's a good question. And going back to the second paragraph of our Credo and, our responsibility to our employees, it starts by helping people taking care of themselves. And especially as a healthcare company, we aspire to bring health and wellness to people around the world. Now, to bring health and wellness outside of Johnson & Johnson, we need to make sure that we role model healthy behavior ourselves. When we talk about the employees of Johnson & Johnson, is outside of, you talked about the spiritual and mental energy, and that's a lot about making sure that the organization is aligned around the purpose. And people understand that there's a higher purpose in everything that we do in terms of bringing health to people around the world. But it also means physical energy, creating healthy atmosphere at work, making sure that we educate people on healthy eating, healthy movement. Those are all the important areas. So when you combine how we organize our workspace, when you combine our ability and encouragement of our employees to have relevant physical activity and then healthy eating, the combination of this creates good, healthy physical energy. And it's also important that we allow time and freedom for people to recover when they need to.
Growth leaders can only scale their business by developing other growth leaders. Scaling people is essential to scaling a business. I wanted to understand how Vladimir identifies other growth leaders.
That is a difficult question to answer, and more difficult, by the way, is to identify the growth leaders. As I built more experience in leadership throughout the years, I've transitioned from looking at somebody's experience to trying to understand their character. And here's what I mean by that. Let's say 20 years ago, I was managing director in Russia. When I would hire sales leaders in the Russian organizations, I would look at their resume. Have they done this type of job before? How have they done it? Have they done it in healthcare industry or elsewhere? And based on that, would make a decision. Today, first of all, the world is changing so fast that the value of experience is significantly diminishing. And it's more the value of learning and the ability of a person to learn and be agile that is becoming much more important. Number two, you are as good of a leader as you are good of a human being. You cannot be a bad, let's say, human being and a good leader. And so I've now transitioned to the thinking that we can teach a person to be competitive. We can teach a person to be a good sales leader or a good marketer. But it's difficult to teach a person to be a grateful, kind, caring, respectful human being. So for me now, the only way to win and the only way to grow is hire first-class leaders that portray extraordinary personal character qualities.
So I guess that's really different from the tendency for organizations to want that perfect person. They have the profile and they should have been in this company in this many years. So it would seem that would also open the door for a lot more diversity of all types in the organization.
Absolutely. And healthcare is a fairly closed industry, meaning it's highly regulated. The opinion across the industry, and I'm generalizing it now, is that somebody needs to grow up in the industry in order to understand it. And so if you look across medtech industry, a vast majority of current leaders are folks that grew up in the industry. I think that is completely outdated. In fact, some of the best leaders that I have on my team, some of them are from healthcare industry, some of them specifically from medtech, some of them from pharm, but some of them come from, completely different industries. And, I go back to the point where we started. It's a couple of things. One is it's their ability to ask the right questions and learn fast. But secondly, it's their personal qualities as human beings that then translate into their leadership quality.
As well as energy, Vladimir understands the importance of recovery. He sees it not only as an important tool for growth leaders, but as their responsibility.
Developing leadership muscle is a lot like going to the gym and building your physical muscles. You start a new exercise and you work hard and you create micro injuries to your muscle, and you wake up next day and your muscles hurt because you haven't used them before. But then you recover, and as you recover, the muscle heals and grows and becomes stronger. I think leadership is exactly like that. You build new experiences. You try to be humble in a way that you accept that you don't know many things, and you learn them in order to grow. And if you fail, that's okay. It's part of growth. But if I, reflect back on my career, the best development times were the times where I took responsibility for something that I did not know before, whether it's new geography, new business, leading new teams, dealing with new customers. And the biggest stretch I had and the more stress I had on myself as a leader, the more I felt I grew.
It's a great example of how growth and learning really go hand in hand. You can't become a growth leader if you can't put yourself into a situation where you're not in control. You need to be out of control. You need to be encountering something new. I thought your example also about thinking about leadership like how you develop a muscle is a really great metaphor, because we often think that the development happens while we're doing it, but in fact, the healing happens in recovery. So it's not necessarily in the moment that we're doing it. It's that we have to have those moments of pain and exertion. And then after that, we have to be able to assimilate and say, what happened? What have I learned? And then use that insight then to change how we do it the next time.
Absolutely. It wouldn't be fun without that, right?
Once Vladimir identifies growth leaders, I'm interested in how he develops them, especially the ones that have an edge for disruption. What have you learned about how to set up a growth leader for success?
That is a great question. And in a way, that question's kind of is an essence of my work. Right? I spend probably 75% of my time on people, with really the goal is how do I make sure that my team and individually the business leaders that work with me are at their best. It starts with selecting top-class leaders. People who are self-motivated, people who are inspiring, people who have a great eye for talent, people who can operate at a high strategic level but at the same time can execute well. People have to have a leadership range in a way, and I think that having leadership range is very important. And then it's really clearing the way for them to be successful, making sure that I as a leader add value to what they try to achieve. And sometimes it requires challenging them. Sometimes it requires inspiring them. Sometimes it requires leaving them alone and trusting them to do their job. So then it really depends on the individual situation and individual leaders.
So you also need a lot of versatility to be able to adjust the kind of support that you're giving.
Absolutely.
Yeah. Our research shows us that sometimes growth leaders have what we call edge. And they might have a bit more urgency, maybe be a little less patient. Now, if they go too far, that's a problem. But often organizations don't let them go far enough. That often organizations that have been around a long time might not be comfortable with some of the behaviors that you need to actually create disruption. What have you learned about helping ensure that the organization can allow that without destroying it?
I mean, first of all, the diversity is one of the key success factors for a team, and making sure that the teams are diverse from many dimensions, from gender, from background, cultures, education, the way of thinking of different leaders. And then if you're united by the same purpose, there are different ways to achieve the goal. And I think it's important to let people achieve what they need to achieve in their own way, because our strengths are different. You cannot make everybody play the same game. You can win in different ways, using, again, going back to our discussion on the strengths, using your own strengths or the strengths of the organization. So starting with diversity is a very important factor. And then for Johnson & Johnson, what's important is that whatever we do is done in a Credo-based manner, that we put our customers, our employees, the communities, and the stakeholders at the forefront of everything we do. Then how you do it is up to those diverse leaders that work on the team.
Thanks to Vladimir Makatsaria for joining me today, and especially for his insights on identifying and developing growth leaders. I'm Allison Eyring. Thanks for listening. On the next episode of Growth Leaders, I'll be talking to Vikram Rupani, co-founder and president of Redmart, one of Asia's fastest growing online retailers. If you like what you hear, please subscribe for free on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Google Podcasts, or wherever you get your podcasts.